Chapter 4. Another unfortunate mishap. She could feel him giving her that same appraising glare that he had given her before, something he had always given her from the moment they had met. It wasn't a leering glare, a look of respite, or anything loving or friendly. It was a look that when they were reading deeply from a novel, or a look of inquiry when they are searching for something. Jonathan Deathshield would often have this look before he would even greet her. Instead of just asking her how her day was, like most normal people, he would skip such pleasantries and get to the point. Some guys who looked in Scarlett's direction would turn away shyly or nervously jerk their head in another direction. She'd sometimes catch her other friend, Chris Deathweaver, looking at her in a similar way, but he would always follow up with a smirk and some joke about the new outfit she had bought at the bazaar. Jonathan never flinched. He would hold her in his gaze for as long as he could, until he came across whatever he needed. If he weren't a death student, she would have found his glaring to be rude. But Scarlett figured this was some sort of necromancer thing, their way of seeing things. However, Jonathan never shared with her what he saw, nor was she curious to know. Part of her was too afraid to ask while the other part enjoyed their staring matches. She would often join him, standing toe-to-toe and eye-to-eye with him until somebody would draw back and retreat. Her efforts were always futile. Jonathan would always win. As she looked down at her new boots, she waited for him to respond to her question, but she knew what he was doing within their silence. Already she could feel him thumbing through her soul, reading for himself about what had happened to her in that warehouse down the alley. At least that's what she thought. At the moment, she was too embarrassed to talk. Before she could take in another breath, she felt his hand grab at hers and pulled her off the side of the fountain. As she stepped forward from the tug, she felt herself trip and fall over something soft at her feet. She looked up to see that she was no longer in Regent Square, but in a beautifully decorated room filled with kimonos and bonsai plants. "You should be more careful, Scarlett," Jonathan said as he made his way into the hall. "Well, if I had known you were porting, then I would have braced myself." He looked over at her as she was picking herself off the floor. An unusual smile came across his face as he eyed her. "I was not referring to your clumsiness, my friend. I meant that place you were at earlier." He left the room, leaving her to brood. Scarlett, grudgingly, sat on the pillow as she waited for him to return. Of course he meant the warehouse. Moments later, Jonathan returned with a tray of hot tea. He sat on the pillow next to hers and poured her a cup mixed with 2 sugars and a lemon. Scarlett thought it was interesting that he would know so much without asking. She watched him pour himself some, then he sat back and cleared his throat. "Okay, spill it." "Spill what? You basically knew what I was up to before you poured my drink." Scarlett took a sip as she kept an eye on him, waiting for his response. Jonathan smiled as he took from his. "Ah, Scarlett, you assume too much," he said as he leaned into her. "I can see that something is on your mind, and yes, part of that comes from necromancy. But any fool can tell there's something troubling you." "So..." His eyebrow rose slightly, gesturing for her to pick up from where he left off. Scarlett exhaled slowly, allowing her ego to deflate a bit more to keep her frustrations at bay. Then she rose up more on her pillow to keep herself from looking hunched over and defeated. As she was about to open her mouth to speak, none of the words would come. She was clueless as to where her story should open. "Just start from the beginning," Jonathan said. "Well," she thought for a moment. "My mother said I was delivered by an orderly who happened to pass the room as he was on his way out." "I meant today, Scarlett." They both laughed. As long as day she had, it felt good to laugh with a friend. Scarlett told him about the message from Triton Alley that Professor Ballstrom couldn't make heads or tails of, and how he had sent her to Krakatopia to figure it out. "Croc," he said, in the same bewildered tone she had when she started the quest. "Yeah, Croc." His eyebrow rose more as he sipped his tea again. Scarlett continued with the story of how she went from Krakatopia's library to the balance school then all the way into the Storm Temple and to the family Jezeret's tomb to find this stone. This, she said to him, was where she first encountered the strange creature. Squid-like? Jonathan asked. Yeah, tentacles. She relayed more of her frustrations to him. The stone split into 3, the trips to Mushu and Dragonspire, and more of the squid-like creatures she faced. Interesting, he said. Scarlet then told him how the stone revealed the message about a new world called Celestia. Jonathan paused midway through his sip. The small glint of surprise in his eye had caught Scarlet believing that he had never heard of the place either, but his expression didn't reveal anything more than that. He still sat back and listened as she told him what occurred in the warehouse. A crab now? He asked. Yes. They must be from that new world, because I've never seen that or the squids anywhere along the spiral. Have you? Jonathan shook his head no. As she was about to go into detail of the battle, Jonathan quickly cleared his throat to gain Scarlet's attention. May I ask you something? He said as his eyes peered in, seeing into her soul. Sure. Although Scarlet wasn't. She wondered why he even bothered with the conversation. Why did you call fairy dust? You must have known that I was in the area from your compass. Even more so, I would have come if you had asked me. Scarlet was surprised by this. Not from the question, but how he seemed offended that she didn't call him first. He was right. She did see him on her compass before she entered in. Her eye was immediately drawn to his name before she looked on to anyone else's. And yet, she didn't call him. She purposely didn't. I didn't want to bother you. She lied. In truth, she didn't want to rely on him too much. Jonathan had been a good friend to her. He filled a void that had been left gaping since Esme and Boris disappeared. As much as she appreciated his friendship, she sometimes felt hindered by it. With Boris and Esme still missing, she'd often wondered how she would feel if Jonathan were to disappear too. I didn't think it was going to be that complicated. Just a matter of picking up a spiral key. It wasn't until we started to come up against these folks that we'd realized how serious this was. She waited for his rebuttal, but he said nothing. He just looked at her, then into his tea. From his lack of reaction, she assumed that he had either bought her excuse or was too disappointed to say anything in return. Scarlet continued on, telling him of the final battle with Estrakar. She told him of the rats that kept protecting him, and the unusually strong shields, the powerful strikes the squid had, and the cat that kept healing whenever fairy dust tried to heal. Jonathan muttered. What? Nothing. So what happened next? Scarlet shrugged. That's it. After the last nova, we managed to escape. Where it ended is where you found me, by the fountain in the square. Jonathan nodded to acknowledge this fact. He sipped a bit more of the tea, then started to look deeply into his cup, keeping silent as he swirled it around. Chris Deathweaver had once told her the different ways necromancers used to see things. Some used objects like playing crystals or crystal balls. More of the older necromancers used things of nature like fire, twigs, and chanting to look into the future. He briefly mentioned tea leaves as a part of doing readings, but said it was a lost art few had mastered. From the way Jonathan stared into his cup, she wondered if he might have found a way of interpreting. Was it bitter? He asked. Bitter? She thought about the word for a moment. I suppose it was. It's never fun being defeated by someone, that's for sure. The whole battle was strange. The shields were too strong, his nova was... and... The words continued to fail her as her frustrations mounted. So yeah, it was a bitter defeat. Felt like I was cheated out of a fair fight. No. Jonathan sipped the tea again with a crumpled face. I meant the tea. Was it bitter to you? Scarlet was floored. I just poured out my heart to you and you're worried about some funky-tasting tea? Jonathan chuckled lightly. You've said many things, Scarlet, but I don't get the feeling we have gotten to the heart of your aggravation. And besides, he got up to remove the tray from the table. You are my guest. I would not dishonor you by serving bad tea. She heard him laughing down the hall as he went to put away the dishes. Scarlet felt a bit embarrassed for herself, and confused by her friend. She never did much entertaining at home. She was too busy fighting or patrolling to do that. Even when Esme and Boris were around, they found ways to have fun in between quests, but they never spent time in the quiet of their houses to talk. Here she was with a friend, in his home, and he was trying to keep her at ease, yet she mistook it for casual aloofness. She felt badly that she couldn't be more comfortable around him. There were times when Jonathan could be very vague, and times when he could be keenly insightful. She appreciated both aspects of him, even though she rarely showed it. "Okay, let's go," Jonathan said as he suddenly appeared next to her. "Go? Where?" "Back to the warehouse, of course," he smiled confidently. "Wait, we're just going to waltz in and fight these things? Didn't you hear a word I said?" "Of course I did," he said, his confidence never failing. "And doesn't it concern you what we're up against?" "It always does, Scarlet." "So?" She gave him a hard look, wishing she had studied necromancy more like he did. He seemed to oblige her inquiry by stepping in closely, widening his eyes so that she could look into his. A mischievous grin spread across his face, like he knew he was going to win this match like all the others. "Do you see my plan, Scarlet?" "Plan? Is that what I'm looking at?" "Of course it is. A well-thought-out plan. A few friends and I have been monitoring the warehouse for some time due to some questionable activity. We had no proof to back up our suspicions, so we had no reason to search the place until now. With our combined knowledge, we have our plan of attack." "Really?" She wasn't doubtful of his words, just amazed that he had come up with a resolution so quickly. "Yes. So you see, you're not simply waltzing. This is more like a well-precision tango." He pulled away, giving her a chance to think over his words, letting her win this one. "And besides, waltzing is for suckers." He was so resolute in his words that Scarlet felt more at ease in their actions. "Are we going alone?" "There are some people who will meet us there that will prove useful in our endeavor." "Is one of them from the life school? 'Cause if not, my friend Fairy..." Jonathan waved his hand nonchalantly. "I'll do the healing if necessary, but if I am right, we won't need to heal at all." Within moments, they were by the fountain in Marleybone's Regent Square. The place was eerily quiet. The street vendors were out with their carts of merchandise, but they were not hustling for a sale like they normally would. All the residents seemed to be at home or huddling in a corner, holding hushed conversations. Jonathan slowly scanned the area until he spotted something familiar. A man with a feathery headdress came walking up to Jonathan with a look of concern on his face. "Marcus, Scarlet Dunestaff. Scarlet, Marcus Dunrunner," Jonathan said, as everyone exchanged greetings. They got down to the business at hand. "I followed up with some of my contacts in Croc. They've said that there is some movement amongst those squid-like people. Looks like they're packing up. Something must have spooked them," said Marcus. "That would be Scarlet's doing, since she took down the first guardian of the stone," Jonathan surmised. "Anything from Sarai?" "She said that she checked the cottage in Mushu and just found scraps of stuff. Nothing more. Word must have spread to them about what happened in Croc, so they cleaned up quickly." Jonathan looked to Scarlet. "Did you notice anything else in the warehouse?" "Nothing out of the ordinary. Some crates here and there, but there was nothing in them." "Well, whatever of value is in there, I suspect is at the top floor with Esterker himself. Security is tighter there, and he seems formidable enough to protect the key instead of leaving the task to a lackey," said Jonathan. The three made their way down the street towards the warehouse. Along the way, Sarai Battlebreeze appeared under a lamppost near the entrance. "You've talked to Shadowscar?" "Yes, but the trail remains cold. These squids gave her straight gold, so there's no paper to trace to anyone or any account from anywhere. Considering what they had asked her to do, she didn't ask them any questions." "Well, considering how the war had been, she more than likely just took the gold and didn't bother with the logistics," said Scarlet. Jonathan agreed. "Well, let us go see what we're up against." "Whoa, Kimosabi." Marcus stepped in Jonathan's way. "We can't just walk in there and stir up trouble. Marleybone's authorities might take offense to it." You know, Sarai spoke, they have been acting kind of weird lately since Meowie already left. I guess with all the mess we had to clean up after the scandal, they've been a bit defensive with other people treading along their territory. Precisely, Jonathan interjected, which is why it's interesting to me that they would have these strange people under their noses and have not raised a fuss over it by now. Jonathan paused as a police officer walked by. The officer regarded the group with the usual gruff and tilt of his hat, but as he walked on, he looked back a couple of times as if he were taking extra notes. Once he was out of sight, Jonathan continued in a hushed voice. Common sense tells us that Meowie couldn't have gotten away with as much if he didn't have help from higher up. Oh! The light went on in Scarlet's head as she caught on to what he was saying. Rumor did have it that some of Mollybone's officials were on Meowie payroll, but no one was ever called out for it. True, and with Meowie and his gang driven out, no one can figure who was under the cat's thumb. Jonathan paused again. His eyes scanned up and down the street. I wouldn't be surprised if there are a few players left here that need to be dealt with. Then these players must have something to do with what's in the warehouse, Sarai stated. And it must have been paid off, just like Shadowscar, probably at a heftier price, considering what's been held up there, said Marcus. So it is agreed. We have Professor Balsam and Headmaster Ambrose to back us up. After all, we came here to get a spiral key by the request of the school. If they should ask, Professor Balsam can verify that much, said Jonathan. What about Esther and them? What if they ask about that? Scarlet's question put a smile on Jonathan's face. We'll just tell them it was one of those unfortunate incidents. Jonathan scanned the area again as he stepped towards the warehouse entrance. You know, the usual mishaps that occur along the spiral.